Good afternoon. I'm bringing this teaching back to just our conversation as we explore different themes that are important for us as believers. And so, this subject that I'm bringing to you today is on the subject of hell and just our interpretation. So, I'm bringing to you today some exploratory realities related to how Christians have historically viewed hell. And I hope it's helpful to you as a follower of Jesus in understanding and developing your own theology on the afterlife. And obviously, we as Christians believe in heaven and hell, and what is hell exactly? What does it look like? And so there's some presuppositions that come into play that I'm going to unpack now as we explore three views of hell that I don't think are talked about enough in local churches. And so I'm bringing that to believers that follow our church and follow us online. So the title of this series is Hell No, Hell Yes, Three Views of Hell that no one talks about. And so we want these to be some empowering and honest conversations that deal with the biblical narrative as it relates to the subject. So just a little bit about this series. We're going to be exploring some themes. That includes the idea of freedom and free will. Galatians talks about how it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. And we believe that we are free agents to make and determine our future. We don't believe in rote determinism. We're also going to look at a cosmic battle of a God who loves us and who cares for us. And we're also going to look at hell as it was defined throughout human history and specifically Christian history. And I'm going to present to you three views of hell. The first one is eternal sentient torment. That's, I would say, the classical view. The second one is annihilationism. And the third and final view is eventual universal redemptionism. And let me just clarify at the outset, this isn't universalism. It has nothing to do with universalism. This is really a idea or a theology connected exclusively to Christian theology. And so I just want to define that. There is universalism that some people believe. We certainly don't believe that. Don't think that is a belief that can be done properly or logically. And so this is a different view of hell. Okay? All right, so we're going to talk a little bit in the beginning here about freedom and what freedom is, for us as followers of Jesus and just humans in general. So how we conceive of an all-powerful God who is creating the universe, right? And so we have this Genesis account of a God who's literally wielding planets and stars and shaping mountains with his hand. And so I would submit to you that a God who created us as agents who are free gives us the capacity to make our choices, that we have free agency. And it's just a reality that God is giving us actually that capacity for freedom, that he's created us in such a way that, the Bible says that God is speaking to his God self, and he says, let us make man in our own image, which is this idea of to give us a sense of autonomy, a sense of freedom, an ability to make decisions that are actual decisions and not just decisions theoretically, that he's sort of defining behind the scenes as a puppet master. They're actually real decisions. And so we believe that as a given for our conversation. And so our freedom to choose is this idea of free will, and we'll get into some of the conversations related to freedom, but I would say that we believe in the ability as agents to make decisions. I've sort of already said that, but there's really some views related to that are not part of our conversation today, but they're important to know. That is Arminianism, which has a strong view of freedom. The second one is Calvinism, and we believe there's some truth to Calvinism, but there's also times to get off that train. But if you've ever heard of Tulip or John Calvin, it's connected there. And there's a strong thread of Calvinism in a lot of Reformed churches, and we certainly welcome you to believe that. You can be part of our church if you believe that. The last one is this idea of an open view of God, which is really even beyond Arminianism. So Isaac Singer once said it this way. He said, we have to believe in free will. We have no choice, which I think is a great quote there. All right, so one of the givens that we come to this conversation about hell with is this idea that God is love. He described himself that way at one point. So God is love. And we believe that God's goal is to give us the ability to choose and have freedom. as we participate in his kingdom and as we walk around. And so I believe the closer you get to Jesus, the actual more freedom that you actually have, because you can be a bond servant to any master, right? But I think the best master to serve is Christ Jesus. And as we participate in love, we enter into more of that freedom. But we also have the ability to refuse that love that God is inviting us into. And that as free agents, we actually have the ability to say no, to not respond in kind, to decide to respond in a different way. And some of that is influenced by spiritual forces and by our flesh, but ultimately we make the decisions and we have the ability to make those decisions. And those decisions have consequences. So I just want to explore this a little bit, both in the Old and in the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, here's what it says about who this God is, right? So whenever we talk about God and we think about an all-powerful, omnipotent God, but also a God who is loving, we have to explore these ideas of God being all-powerful and God being all-loving. And how do those two connect? How do they relate? So in Psalm 74, it says, Yahweh broke the heads of the dragons in the waters and crushed the heads of the Leviathan. So this is a powerful being. Isaiah writes, on that day the Lord with his great sword will punish the Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, the Leviathan, the twisting serpent. He will kill the head of the dragon that is in the sea. So this is a powerful being. In the New Testament, we see Jesus, who is the incarnation or a reality of God in flesh. And Jesus, as the eternal Son, is demonstrating to us that God has come down to us. So Jesus' ministry is in the assumption that creation has been seized by a cosmic force, and now God himself has stepped down into human history to actually rescue us from the dominion of darkness. And that he is fighting a war, and that the war that he's fighting is against the adversary or the enemy, the warrior named Satan. So Jesus refers to Satan in the Gospels as the prince, the archon of this age. That's the Greek word there. And he uses that word 3 times in the book of John, in John chapter 12, 14, and 16. And so Jesus taught that those who wish to make headway in tearing down the evil one's kingdom, they must first tie up the strong man. Again, so we're seeing this cosmic reality of battle take place. Oh, there's more. And so in the New Testament, the writers of the New Testament, they of course leaned on and looked at the Old Testament, but they saw that the world was at war and that God doesn't always get his way. It's not like he has an easy button that he pushes and it all just changes. There's a fight. There's a battle. Ultimately, God is all powerful, but there's a fight involved. And so God's goal, his ultimate goal for all creation, is beautifully expressed in Jesus' prayer in John 17, where Jesus says that they may be one, even as we are one. And Jesus wishes that the whole world would be whole in his prayer. And we see this, even this idea of oneness and unity. In the epistles, Paul is describing it in the book of Romans, and he's saying the entire creation groans for the day when heaven and earth come together. And so there's this idea of God's culmination and his desire for his creation that ultimately has the freedom and the capacity for goodness and for the fruits of the Spirit, but also for the deeds of darkness and for the twisted realities of taking that freedom and decided to do something that it wasn't intended to do with, right? The ability to take a raw material and to twist it one way or the other is the idea of choice. And an all-powerful God is giving his creation the ability to do that because he ultimately wants real love, I believe. And he wants a real creation that is not a robotic creation. I'm getting ahead of myself. But we have this idea that we do have the freedom, and we have the freedom to fall, and we have the freedom to war. And so this idea is that love actually has to be chosen Love entails a sense of risk, and that risk, I believe, constitutes our moral responsibility as human beings. That we don't necessarily have a right to do whatever we want. We have a responsibility, a moral one, to choose goodness. And that level of goodness must also be proportionate to our moral capacity, our epistemological capacity even for evil. That the amount of goodness that we could potentially do is also balanced by the negative or the evil that we could do. And that when we are deciding, it's true goodness we're deciding, because in fact we really are deciding. Well, at some point, all things come to an end, and as creatures, we all have an end point. We have an expiration point. C.S. Lewis said it this way. He said, finality, however, must come some time. And so, as created free creatures, our world was created by God for massive freedom and the potential both for good and for evil. And that is a war that's going on in our hearts, in our souls, in our bodies. And it's a war that's actually outside our body. It's a cosmic war. There's spiritual influences. And it's a mess. There's stuff going on, and it's a nightmare. It's the stuff of nightmares. And this leads us often to the question of why. And so we have to begin asking, why does God tolerate all this ongoing activity of evil agents? In other words, a lot of atheists are going to ask the question, what the heck is he waiting for? Why does God appear so arbitrary in his interactions with free agents? And these are legit, non-strawman questions that I think we have to answer. And I think the best answer is to just say that God's actually active. He's actually improving the world. He's accomplishing impossible feats. If we take biblical understanding at all, we believe that when we pray and when we enter into the spiritual space of prayer, we're actually changing the world and changing what is possible to God, for God to do. And so while the past is fixed, our future remains open, and we have a chance to make the most of it. And so logically, just thinking about it, we must conclude that every single event in the cosmos is universally influenced, and it has a level of social determinability. But again, the onus and the responsibility and the consequence of any given action still remain with the agent. We decide what we do and how we carry out an action. We think about it, we're influenced by other parties, but we get to decide. And yet, I think God always is the most influential in directing the flow of space and the flow of grace in time and throughout human history. But he is not and cannot be the only free agent, or it's all simply determinism. And that would really create an evil God. If it was all determined by God and God was like, oh, these people are going this way, these people are going that way. No, I think the most loving that God could be is actually to give all of us agency and freedom. And that is, I think, a great introduction or a given into our conversation on the subject of hell. So, what exactly is it? What exactly is this idea of hell? I think that's really important for our conversation and kind of where we're going. And so, in breaking the mold, we're going to go beyond typical explanations that I think sometimes churches have on this subject. And so, in the series, again, we're going to explore three views. Number one is eternal sentient torment. The next is annihilationism. And finally, eventual universal redemptionism. Okay, and so let's talk about some of the Bible words as it relates to this idea of what hell is. The first one is Sheol. So Sheol is mentioned about 65 times in the Old Testament as the underworld, or the opposite of the promised land. It has three spaces in it: Sheol, the pit, and the extremities of the pit. So it's sort of a reversal or the opposite, an unholy opposite of the temple as depicted in Judaism. So that's Sheol. The next one is Hades. So Hades is used 9 times in the New Testament. It's translated as Hades or hell or death's kingdom or the grave. And this is often viewed as the New Testament's understanding of a Jewish idea of Sheol. And so in much of Christian theology, Hades is seen as an intermediary state before the last judgment. Another word is the word Gehenna. No, not Gehenna. That's here in Columbus, and it's actually a nice space. But Gehenna, it's used 12 times in the New Testament, and it's translated into modern English as hell. And so the Greek word Gehenna is a word translated for hell that comes up from the Hebrew word Gehinnom, which just simply means the valley of wailing, or the valley of weeping, the valley of intense crying that would come after someone has died. The last word for hell is the word Tartaro. In the Bible, Tartarus is a place of temporary punishment for fallen angels who denied God and were banished from heaven. Like Hades, Tartaro exists in other ancient literature as well. So this idea of Sheol is this idea of an exile or an exilic wilderness. So somebody who's kicked out of a cultivated space and dropped into a place where there is just not a lot of resources. It's a place you can't get back from, and it's full of dust. And the only meal actually in Sheol is actually dust and ash. And so in Psalms chapter 6 it says, "In death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise?" Isaiah 38:18 says, "Sheol does not thank you. Death does not praise you. Those who go down to the pit do not hope for your faithfulness." So in the book of Ezekiel, in the book of Job and Isaiah, Sheol is sort of, again, an unholy temple. So there's Sheol, there's the pit, and there's the place outside the pit. And so when you look at Mesopotamian culture, you see this idea of the underworld as a gated community. You see this in the Hebrew. Ezekiel refers to the rivers of Sheol, which is a feature widely attested in the Mesopotamian underworld. And so Sheol swallows death, and Mot is insatiable. This is Habakkuk. Death is strong. Death is a shepherd and a source of plagues. Okay? And so 9 times in the New Testament, we again see the word Hades, which is translated a variety of ways. And this is the New Testament understanding of an intermediate state between heaven and hell, in which the dead will enter and remain until the last judgment. So there were different views of Hades. Catholic and Lutheran and Anabaptist and Anglican teach that Hades is a place of each the existence of an intermediary state after the departure of the soul and the body until the last judgment. This intermediate state, known as Hades, is divided into 2 chambers. One is a place of paradise for the righteous, and 2 is the place of Gehenna for the wicked. So those are some of the views of Hades. The Greek word for Gehenna, which I mentioned earlier, is Gehinnom. Again, that's this idea of waiting. And so this valley was actually outside of Jerusalem, and Jesus was talking about these fires that actually were started by some of Israel's evil kings that will eventually be used for justice so that God's kingdom will once again be pure and for all. The fire was just sort of smoldering for a time. Jesus is saying this place is going to change. In the Bible, Tartarus is a place of temporary punishment for fallen angels. And so in 2 Peter 2:4, it's where it's mentioned. And so it says, "For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but threw them out into Tartarus and delivered them to be kept in the chains of darkness until the judgment." So there's some themes here. As we've looked at the 4 Bible words, there's separation from God, there's judgment, there's a consequence of sin, There's God's justice, his mercy, but there's also some hope and redemption as we read the biblical narrative and come up with a theology related to all these things. And so Jesus ultimately came to take away the fear of death. And the writer of 1 John says that perfect love actually casts out fear. John says that Jesus came because he so loved us, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. And so when we look at these themes and this theology, we see very much Jesus wasn't joking around about hell. He was talking about a real place. But that he was also sent as a deliverer to rescue us from that darkness. And so as we kind of wrap up this part of our conversation, I don't want to leave us in a dark place, but I just want to remind us the New Testament was written because hope remains, and that there is a hope against all hope. There is an anchor for our soul. There is grace for us as we follow Jesus, that we can be set free and we can be in a place with him in heaven forever and ever.